and welcome back to Cake Over Keto, your non-diet podcast that stands up against diet culture so you can eat the goddamn cake without anxiety and guilt. I am Mel Wakeman, registered nutritionist, intuitive eating practitioner, non-diet counsellor and lover of carrot cake. I specialise in disordered eating and recovering from chronic dieting, weight and body image concerns, all through a weight-inclusive lens. Cake Over Keto is a fortnightly slice of food and body truth with dollops of compassion and sprinkles of salvation. I am here to provide a safe, healing space for those on their way to food and body freedom. As I do this, I may mention body weight, calories, and the O word. Although there will always be context, please be mindful if you are triggered by these. So put that kettle on, find a seat in the shade and sit with me for 20-ish minutes. And while that kettle boils, if you'd like to find me on social media, please do. I'm on Instagram and now TikTok, living at large with the young'uns at Cake Over Keto. I'm also on LinkedIn as Mel Wakeman. So keep your ears plugged in. What's coming up in this episode is right around the corner. I'm going to talk about eating disorders and menopause in this episode, which is episode 8. Now, when you think of an eating disorder, you might think of a young white teenage girl, perhaps a privilege, with anorexia nervosa. But when we consider eating disorders are most common in folk between the ages of 16 and 40, you might start to think about the wider range of people who are affected. Because did you know who also suffers a lot? Women in midlife. Women between 45 and 60 years old. And when I'm referring to an eating disorder, I'm thinking mostly of anorexia nervosa, bulimia nervosa, or binge eating disorder, BED, because these are diagnosed using a list of expected behavioural, psychological and physical symptoms. But I'm also going to consider orthorexia, although this doesn't have a clinical diagnostic label or criteria. And there's also when a person's symptoms don't exactly fit the expected symptoms for anorexia, bulimia or binge eating disorder, in which case they might be diagnosed with an other specified feeding or eating disorder, basically called OSFED. Now, OSFED is very common and accounts for the highest percentage of eating disorders across all ages. Now, a 2012 study reported that 13% of women over the age of 50 experience symptoms of an eating disorder. And I would kind of wonder what the stats would say now, 10 years on, post-pandemic, you know? The link to this paper is in the show notes, by the way. And what I mean by can experience symptoms of an eating disorder, it means they can develop disordered eating or an eating disorder, or for a past eating disorder to re-emerge. So one that happened perhaps during puberty or adolescence and re-emerged later on in life. Because menopause, midlife, can be a bloody tough time. From my experience, it's certainly a roller coaster, a ride where you can feel totally out of control of your body, unexpected things happening with no concept of why, and then feeling trepidation mixed with hope as to what might come around the next bend and having a sense of leaving your past self behind. And with changing hormone levels that can impact body shape and weight, there can be a loss of identity and confidence can plummet. And one of the first things folk change when experiencing these sorts of things is their eating habits. So I want to explain in this episode why, in terms of how our hormones might be impacting us, which can influence how we cope with life and how we see ourselves. And then I'll dip into the pick and mix at the end where I've got some helpful resources to chew on. Stay tuned. You can't tell by looking at someone that they have an eating disorder. Many are hiding in plain sight. Eating disorders which disproportionately affect women are often and incorrectly thought to affect mostly teenage girls, but the reality is eating disorders occur in all ages, in all genders, races, ethnicities, and cultures in countries across the globe. And we're now seeing younger and younger girls and boys developing them, but also in the older population. And there's been a 33% rise of eating disorders in women over 50 recently. In fact, the prevalence of eating disorders is higher in women at perimenopause compared with pre and postmenopause. Risks for eating disorders involve a complex interplay between socio-cultural and environmental, psychological and biological influences. And to give you some examples, biological risk factors include things like genetics. They can run along family lines, ovarian hormone levels. Psychological risk factors include perfectionism, anxiety disorders such as OCD. And the socio-cultural or environmental factors include appearance, ideal, internalization, weight stigma. And what's likely to trigger eating disorder development are times of high stress and transition in life. These are periods when folk are at their most vulnerable. Now, if we think about the sorts of things that can happen in midlife, there's a likelihood of relationship difficulties or breakdowns, experiencing the death of a loved one, moving house, changing jobs or experiencing job pressures, maybe the acknowledgement of the loss of reproductive ability, experiencing empty nest syndrome, living in the sandwich years, which I'm kind of doing now, developing health concerns and worries, and of course, going through hormonal chaos that can make all of these things harder. Now, eating disorders are not about vanity or food directly. They're about emotions and feelings. They're about what's underneath the surface. Something's deep that feels too much, that numbing or blocking out could help. And so, it's often difficult emotions and trauma. And women in midlife have more likely had more things happen to them, more chapters in their lives, experienced more things, perhaps that they haven't been able to address in a healthy way or come to accept. So, menopausal transition is likely a window of vulnerability for eating disorders and body image disturbance. And as a midlife woman myself, is there something about being older that comes with an expectation that we should know, or we should have all the answers by now, to be the one to keep everything together? Perhaps we are caring for children and parents, and having the time to take care of your own needs can feel non-existent. So these are kind of some of the thoughts that have been going through my head as I've researched for this podcast. But before we get on to kind of the hormone stuff, let me do a quick explanation as to what's happening in menopause transition. Because although over the last couple of years, particularly, there's been a lot more conversation about it, which is great. We're starting to take the taboo out of menopause. There's still quite a bit of misunderstanding. So the menopause occurs when the ovaries slow down and they stop producing eggs, and therefore the levels of estrogen, progesterone and testosterone fall over time. Now, considering we've got 20 minutes for this episode, I want to focus most on estrogen, and I'll talk a little bit about the others. And really, I probably should be saying estradiol. That's the most active form of estrogen in women, but I'm just going to stick with estrogen here for simplicity. So when you have no symptoms of perimenopause or menopause, you're in pre-menopause. Perimenopause is when you experience menopausal symptoms, of which there are many. We're going like over 35 these days, due to hormone changes, but you still get your period. Now, menopause is when you don't have a period for 12 consecutive months. And actually, it's like one day, with the average age of menopause being 51. But symptoms of perimenopause often start earlier, on average around 45. I think I was 44 when I recognized it, but in hindsight was probably going through earlier stuff, just not realizing it for a year or two perhaps before that. And then postmenopause is the time in your life after you've not had a period for 12 consecutive months. So starting from your early 40s, your estrogen may well start to fluctuate, and it can sometimes soar to almost 3 times your younger adult levels to crash down again to almost nothing. And these are typically daily fluctuations, which can be responsible for the wide-ranging variation of symptoms and the fact that no 2 days or consecutive days are ever really the same. And at the same time, progesterone is perhaps more quietly just going away, although not necessarily in a linear way. Coming back to perimenopause and the symptoms, many of them have been linked specifically, not exclusively, to changing and declining estrogen levels. Now, if we think for a moment about the fact that estrogen receptors exist in cells all over our body, so it's no wonder symptoms are wide and varied when it comes to impacting whole body function. Estrogen is a wonderful skin moisturizer. It lubricates our eyes, our joints, the vagina. It supports hair growth and libido, regulates temperature, helps with memory and cognitive function. It increases bone density and protects our blood vessels. When estrogen levels fall, it can really feel like you're living in someone else's body. A body that doesn't tend to do what it used to do or behaves in ways you didn't expect or don't want to. And the menopausal symptoms my disordered eating and eating disorder clients struggle most with are the increased anxiety, the low mood or the mood swings, weight gain, shape change, digestive issues and bloating, because they make managing their distorted body image thoughts and almost self-destructive eating behaviors that much harder. And this can all be exacerbated by other menopausal symptoms like insomnia, brain fog, joint pain, bladder issues, and loss of libido, and so on. And what the research is showing us at the moment, because actually this is a relatively new area, traditionally menopausal women have been excluded from eating disorder research, is that changes in estrogen levels in some women during perimenopause are key to eating disorder onset or relapse at midlife. Now, this could be a primary effect of estrogen decline affecting the body and the brain, because the limbic region of our brain relies on estrogen for mood stability, for sleep, memory, concentration, energy, and libido. But it might also be through secondary effects such as reduced serotonin, which is our feel-good hormone that also influences mood, because estrogen supports serotonin production and the production of serotonin receptors in the brain. So when estrogen falls, typically so does serotonin. Now, low mood is a very common symptom in menopause transition and is something that could certainly trigger an eating disorder or relapse. And just to say here, low mood is not the same as clinical depression for many women, but is often characterized by feeling very flat and experiencing a loss of joy and interest in life. And clinical depression is one of the most common mental health diagnoses to coexist with eating disorders. In fact, between 50 to 75% of those that struggle with an eating disorder will also experience symptoms of depression. Another interesting link exists between stress hormones and estrogen, progesterone, and testosterone. Now, adrenaline and cortisol levels, our stress hormones, can rise in some women during menopause transition because of kind of all of the above that I've just been talking about, all the chapters in the life and things going on in the symptoms. And this production of the stress hormones affects the production of the sex hormones, the estrogen, progesterone, and testosterone. And long story short, and maybe you could look up what's called the pregnenolone or cortisol steal. When we are stressed, the body prioritizes cortisol production because that's part of our self-protection response. It's our fight and flight safety response, but at the expense of estrogen, progesterone, and testosterone. So when these hormones levels drop, because the body's having to make more cortisol, this can also contribute to greater mood disturbance. And I think, to share with you, this is certainly something that I experienced because of my underlying anxiety. In my perimenopause journey, I got particularly anxious, and it turned out that I had really low testosterone levels. So I got kind of really ragey, proper ragey. Now, individuals with anxiety, depression, and eating disorders also share a few symptoms, such as feelings of low self-worth, which can contribute to the development or maintenance of these disorders. And folks with anxious and depressive symptoms can experience varying appetite changes, which may leave them vulnerable to disordered relationships with food. So either experiencing binge eating episodes or wanting to restrict. And what's coming up again and again in the literature is an increased susceptibility specifically to binge eating. And 46% of those with binge eating disorder also experience depressive symptoms. And binge eating disorder involves similar feelings of depression, such as low self-worth, shame, guilt, and hopelessness. So using binge eating behaviors in an attempt to cope with the difficult emotions associated with depression, but depression can also be a side effect of binge eating behaviors as folk feel more worthless and helpless as they become trapped. It's kind of, you get stuck in a cycle of binge eating. And similar associations are seen in bulimia nervosa, the eating disorder that coexists with clinical depression the most. And just over 70% of folk struggling with bulimia are being diagnosed with depression at the same time. And again, there's a similarity here in terms of sharing emotional and cognitive symptoms such as low self-worth, loneliness or isolation, feeling out of control, anger and irritability, inadequacy. So these disorders also have the shared consequences of impaired social functioning. Additionally, the impact that purging behaviours has on the brain and body can make depressive symptoms more likely to develop and emotional regulation more difficult for the person. So cycles of behaviours are kind of emerging here as being quite common. Now, there's an interesting pilot study that's quite recent, and because it's a pilot, it's very small, so we need to bear that in mind. The link to this is in the show notes, by the way. And this found that progesterone levels seem to shape the impact of estrogen on body image symptoms in terms of body dissatisfaction and eating disorder symptoms. So what they found was that estrogen was positively associated with binge eating episodes. So when estrogen levels were higher, binge eating episodes were higher, but only when progesterone was high, not when progesterone was low. And they also noticed that low estrogen levels were linked to worse body dissatisfaction when progesterone levels were high. But bear with me, when progesterone levels were low, lower levels of body dissatisfaction were linked to higher levels of estrogen. It's a bit swings and roundabouts, isn't it? I hope you're still with me. But I think, no, this is kind of what we're starting to learn and understand. And this is so helpful in being able to predict, we're identifying which members of our population are vulnerable, also how we can support menopausal women more effectively. Now, when we don't like what we see, when we're experiencing body dissatisfaction, what do? We tend to look to move away from our body. And that can show up as either disconnecting and over time dissociating from our body. And we see that with bulimic episodes and binge eating disorder, or a need to change our body. And whether that's kind of conforming to society's expectations or how you were in your younger life. Because society says that we can, and that therefore we should focus on our appearance and look to change who we are, because apparently that's better. It's not, as bollocks, isn't it? But if we just nip back to that 2012 study I mentioned right at the beginning, the body image one, that paper also reported 60% of the women in the study disclosed concerns about their weight, and 70% were actively trying to lose weight. So these percentages really highlight another reason midlife women can be particularly vulnerable to eating problems. We live in an ageist society. Our culture values thinness over healthiness. And even though menopause typically and naturally brings an increase in belly fat and weight gain, it's seen as a problem. Society wants us to fight this normal, natural body shift, because if you don't, hey, you just don't care. You're not trying hard enough. How many times have you heard someone else say, God, she's let herself go? And if you head back to the last two episodes, 6 and 7, I go more into that in terms of our relationship with our body and our scales. But all this misinformation about the so-called harms of belly fat and belly and wanting to melt menopausal fat, it adds fuel to this fire. And I see and hear a lot from menopausal women, and certainly my clients, absolute frustration and almost panic and despair about what used to work to reduce body weight no longer does. And that quote unquote failure is taken personally. Society placing unattainable standards on women is just kind of not recognized. And we see that finding acceptance is giving up. So the rhetoric is try harder and harder and keep pushing. But this opens the door to restricting eating habits, to having or wanting more control over food, and possibly using exercise to punish or compensate for eating. And if anything is going to instigate binge eating behaviours, it's trying to starve a body that is stressed to the hilt. So what the world needs right now is more of the right information to help women better navigate this part of their lives. We need more awareness, and we need better access to mental health services, to be honest. We need more education, more understanding and empathy. And we need GPs to get that there is no set look for disordered eating or an eating disorder. Did you know that less than 6% of folk with eating disorders are classed as underweight? Now, I'm not sure how, but we need to challenge the weight bias at work in our culture that limits our access to weight neutral information. Okay, I'd better stop now before I run out of time. I hope this has been insightful and helpful. You may have some questions, so my contact details will be at the end of this episode. Coming up next is my pick and mix. I'll be back in just a second. Okay, folks, let's open up the pick and mix. And it seems most appropriate for this episode to signpost you to more information should you need it. These are all UK-based links, and they're all in the show notes for you. Okay, so number one is you can get information support, including help for carers about all things eating disorders from the charity Beat. And their website is beateatingdisorders.org.uk. They do have a national helpline. There's a whole plethora of resources on there. It's a fantastic place to begin. Number two is the UK National Centre for Eating Disorders, which is at eating-disorders.org.uk. And again, they provide a huge library of information, and they also offer treatment and counselling options. Next is Healing Minds. Now, this is founded by therapist Bernie Wright, who is a connection of mine. And she trained at the National Centre for Eating Disorders and is a registered supervisor. So yes, she offers supervision and training, but she also offers counselling, and details are on her website. Oh, and there's me. Yep, there's me doing food work, and I work alongside psychotherapists that in terms of part of what is usually expected to be a multidisciplinary team. And for menopause support, please do check out balancemenopause.com. Now, this is created by Louise Newson, who you may have heard of as a menopause specialist. And basically this holds the world's biggest menopause library. It's filled with medically approved content, and there's videos and downloads and fact sheets, you name it. Anything that you wanted to know about menopause will be on there. And there's also an app that you can download to track your symptoms. And Louise, who founded Balance, also leads a menopause and wellbeing centre that's based in Stratford-upon-Avon in the UK, and that comes under newsonhealth.co.uk. So that's it from me, friends. Maybe a lot in this episode, and thank you so much for joining me and holding through this. If you've liked what you've heard, please do subscribe, and so you don't miss what's coming up in episode 9, which is the truth about weight loss surgery. Now, if your podcast platform allows you to rate this podcast or leave a review, I would love you forever if you could do that for Keto over Keto. And if you'd like to carry on the conversation, please do email me at mel@wakenutrition.com. Or come and find me on Instagram at Keto over Keto. And yeah, I'm dancing around, not really actually, on TikTok, providing Aids of Recovery from Eating Disorder page over there. So yeah, I'm open to hearing your questions and thoughts on this. Take care of yourselves, and I will see you next time. Bye.
This has been a Monkey Pants Productions podcast.